Hello and welcome back. And now we're going to continue with our discussion of the skeletal system. And in this part, we are going to learn about long bone anatomy and what makes up bone, as well as the anatomy of all the other types of bone shapes. So for this first portion, we're only talking about long bones, bones that are longer than they are wide. And so there is an example of a humerus for the picture because that is obviously a long bone. Now that you know your bones, you'll know which end of them is proximal and which end of them is distal. So I'll be incorporating those words in this discussion. When we look at a long bone, the shaft of the bone is known as the diaphysis. Okay, that prefix dia means to go through something. And if you remember that prefix epi means it's on something, then the two ends of the bones, which are wider than the diaphysis, are each called an epiphysis. So we have a proximal epiphysis in the humerus where the head is, and a distal epiphysis in the humerus where the capitulum and the trochlea are located. Okay. Now, completely surrounding the bone, we are going to be having a dense connective tissue covering known as periosteum. And going through the periosteum and into the bone are going to be blood vessels bringing nutrients in and little blood vessels taking waste out. And so what these blood vessels are called nutrient arteries. And they enter the bone through little tiny holes, which you can see with your eye in the bone. And those holes are called nutrient foramina. Okay. So a little blood vessel or branch of a blood vessel will enter through each nutrient foramen, and then it will divide, bifurcate, and make many little branches which will go through all the structures of the bone we'll be talking about shortly. So in a long bone, in the shaft or diaphysis of a long bone, there actually is a center portion that does not contain any type of bony tissue, no compact bone, no spongy bone. And that area is called the medullary cavity. If you remember previously, we said in organs, oftentimes the outer portion is called the cortex and the deeper portion is called the medulla. So this is a cavity in the deeper portion, and we call that the medullary cavity. However, this space is not hollow. It is filled with something known as yellow bone marrow. And we'll look at what yellow bone marrow is shortly. On the two epiphyses of the bone, at the areas where there is going to be a joint, we have cartilage, which we call articular cartilage. And as we know from studying cartilage before, this is going to be hyaline cartilage. So you can call it either, just by labeling it articular cartilage, just reminds you there is an articulation going on here. So there's articular cartilage at both epiphyseal ends of a long bone. Okay. And then, as I mentioned before, surrounding the bone, we have the dense connective tissue, just like we had surrounding cartilage. And in cartilage, we called it perichondrium, and in bone, we're going to call it periosteum. Looking at things a little closer up, now this is a picture of the femur with the coxal bone, and this is the head of the femur, and this is the neck of the femur. At the very edge of the epiphysis, at the junction with the next area of bone, there is something called the epiphyseal plate. And what the epiphyseal plate is, as we'll learn shortly, it's a piece of cartilage that exists because this is where the long bone growth is going to occur. Now, the epiphyseal plate is something that you may already know, but you call it by the layman's term growth plate. So just replace that word growth with the word epiphyseal. Now, after you're done growing, so when puberty is completely over, your college age, and you're no longer growing any taller, we have no need for a plate of cartilage, and it gets completely replaced with bone. And then we can see a small line where it once existed, and this is the epiphyseal line. Now, of course, this picture of bone is not of the femur. It's just another bone. Probably looks like the proximal portion of the tibia. And there is the epiphyseal line, which marks where the epiphyseal plate used to be present. All right. So I mentioned previously about yellow bone marrow, but there are actually two types of bone marrow. There's what we call red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. So from this point on, it's very important that you write either red or yellow, and don't just write bone marrow. So the yellow bone marrow is located in the medullary cavity of the diaphysis of a long bone. That's the only place it's found. Any place else that there is a space in a bone, so think the spongy bone everywhere else in your body, that's going to be red bone marrow. So here is a picture of what all the little bony tuberculi spicules of bone and spongy bone look like. And you can see that there's lots of spaces between them, and at first glance it looks hollow. But when you look at the microscopic picture on the bottom left, the dark pinkish things, those are the little bony trabeculi. And you can see that those spaces are actually full of this tissue, which is the red bone marrow. And it's in the red bone marrow that that process of hematopoiesis is going to take place. So here's a side-by-side comparison of two different areas of the same bone. Both of these are pictures taken like from a femur. So on the right, we have a cross section going through the diaphysis of the femur. You can see all the compact bone. There's a little bit of spongy bone, and there's this huge medullary cavity filled with this yellowish stuff and just a little bit of reddish stuff. So that's the yellow bone marrow. Now, if you contrast that to the head of the femur, which is the picture with the circular structure, you can see the compact bone on the outside. You can see lots of spongy bone, and you can see everything there is mostly red with just a little bit of yellow on the inside. So this is what red bone marrow looks like. If you look histologically at the red bone marrow on the far left picture, you can see individual adipocytes. So yes, there's adipose tissue in the red bone marrow. So red bone marrow, really red, lots of cells, which are the precursors for all of the blood cells in that process of hematopoiesis. We also have little blood vessels, capillaries there, so those cells can leave. Contrast that to yellow bone marrow, which is almost all adipose tissue. Okay. So let's look a little bit closer at that hematopoiesis that occurs in bone. It only is going to occur in the red bone marrow. And so here's a cartoon drawing showing all the different types of cells, and it also shows that we have individual adipocytes. At this point, it's not important to learn the names of these various cells. You will get that in the second semester when you study the cardiovascular system. So where in the body do we have red bone marrow? Well, that depends on how old you are. When you were born, because you did not have that many bones, all of your bones essentially had this red bone marrow, so you can make all these blood cells. And then as you age, the amount of bone you have is much higher compared to the volume of blood cells that you need. So less and less of your bones are containing red bone marrow, and all these, and a lot of them are shifting over. And so if we look, for instance, just at the femur, what you will notice at birth, almost the entire femur does hematopoiesis, but by the time you're an adult and ready to graduate from college, it's only the proximal portion of the femur that does any hematopoiesis. And we actually can look at the entire body and to see when you're an adult, that there are not that many places that do hematopoiesis, and the easiest places to get to are going to be the sternum as well as the ilium, specifically the iliac crest, okay? So we transition from pretty much everything to this earlier on, and then by the time you are an adult, it is the picture in the center on the top. So let's look at those bone marrows, those bone membranes a little closer. So I have mentioned the periosteum a couple of times, so let's start with the periosteum. So as we know, periosteum is a dense connective tissue. Specifically, it's dense irregular because we want the collagen fibers not to be just aligning with the length of the bone, but also to be aligning around the circumference of the bone as well. And when we look at the periosteum, and if you look at the picture, if you start up here, you can see the periosteum, which is attached to the bone, but then further down, they have detached it so you can see the detail. And if you look at the periosteum, what you can notice, there's actually two layers there. So it's this outer portion of the periosteum that is this fibrous layer, which is the dense, irregular connective tissue. So it's called the outer fibrous layer of periosteum. And what it's made out of is dense, irregular connective tissue. So in addition to the outer fibrous layer, we are going to have an inner cellular layer. And if you look at this, you can see that they've made it a whole bunch of little cells along its length. And it's in this inner cellular layer where we're going to find all the cells involved with osteogenesis. Do you think you can think of any? Yeah, so of course, this is where we're going to find that osteochondral progenitor cells, but we're also going to find the cells it produces, such as those osteoblasts, which we haven't talked about yet. Now, the third interesting thing about the periosteum is that it just doesn't lie right on top of the bone. There are actually collagen fibers that go from that outer fibrous layer among the cellular layer and go into the bony tissue, okay? So if you pull the periosteum off the compact bone, you can clearly see these fibers. And these are either called perforating fibers because they perforate into the bony lamella, or you call Sharpie's fibers. So if you look at the models of the osteon for lab, you can, there's a really good model where you can see these perforating or Sharpie's fibers. Now, just like we have periosteum on the outer part of the bone, we have to have a lining everywhere we have a surface. And so that means where we have the spongy bone in the deeper portion of the bone, we are going to have dense, irregular connective tissue covering it there as well on the medullary portion of the bone. Only we're not going to call it periosteum because peri means to go around, as in around the outside. We're going to call it endo because endo means inside. So periosteum, two layers on the outside, endosteum on the inside. And that covers all of the spongy bone. As well, it's going to line any of these tunnels going through the compact bone. All the things that we're going to call canals are going to be lined by that endosteum. So let's look at the structural and functional unit of compact bone, which is known as the osteon. So think of it as one tree trunk cut. And so when you look at this, what you can notice is that there are rings, just like in a tree. And so we have smaller rings near that center opening, and they get bigger and bigger and surround each other. And so each ring is specifically a lamella, only we call them concentric lamella because they go around each other in their entirety. So the picture on the right has taken these lamella and pulled them up where they kind of look like a a wedding cake, but I want you to realize they're all going to be the entire length. But by pulling them up, we can see something else that's going on with these concentric lamella, and that is, look at these blue lines. If you notice, the blue lines of one lamella are perpendicular to the blue lines of the adjacent lamella, and they go back and forth this way. And what these blue lines represent are the directions of the fibers, the collagen fibers in this bony tissue, which are giving it strength. And what this allows, if there's some type of a mild twisting motion, we would only have breakages in one direction, whereas the adjacent lamella would not have been affected, and so it would still have full strength and not have any type of microscopic fracturing going on. In the middle of each osteon, there is a tunnel, a space known as the central canal. So the central canal is in the center of the osteon, and it is not hollow. It actually contains blood vessels and nerves. So that bone is innervated and it is vascular. It has a very rich nutrition coming in little branches of arteries, and then it has little veins taking the waste products out. So let's take a wedge of compact bone and look at it closer. On the left, we have the periosteum, and the nutrient blood vessel comes in, and then once it's through the periosteum, we're going to call it a periosteal blood vessel. And what you will see is it will branch, and some branching goes perpendicular, whereas other branches are going to go along the length of the long bone. And then eventually the blood vessel makes its way to the spongy bone, where it travels among all the bony trabeculi. So the tunnels which travel perpendicular to the length of the bone are known as perforating canals. So in this picture, we clearly can see an osteon with its central canal in the middle, which means that all of this is a central canal, just like all of this is a central canal. And what is connecting two central canals are blood vessels and a perforating canal. Now let's look at one osteon up close. So we are going to take a wedge of one osteon, and it would look like this picture. So in this picture on the upper left, the drawing, in this pinkish area, that's where the central canal would be, containing the blood vessels and nerves. And then this shows 1, 2, 3, 4 concentric lamellae. And what you need to notice is between the concentric lamella, we have these cells, okay? I know they're yellow, but they're not adipose cells and they're not nervous cells. Just pretend they're blue or some other color, okay? And so the cells are not in the lamella, but the cells are between the lamella, okay? And so if you look at a scanning electron micrograph picture of an osteon, you can clearly see a huge central canal in the middle. And then you can see these little shallow depressions, and these shallow depressions are the spaces that will be containing these cells. Okay. So this is what the bony matrix of bone looks like. So the cells which are in these spaces are the mature cells, and they are called osteocytes. And the space that contains the osteocyte, which you clearly can see so well on the scanning electron microscope picture, each of these is a lacuna. So each lacuna contains an osteocyte. But I need to point out a couple of other things. And so the question is, if the blood vessel is here, I can kind of understand that the cells close to it might get some nutrition, but how do these far away cells get nutrition? And for that, we need to look at the structure of the osteon a little bit closer and realize that in the lamella, there are these microscopic, they look like little cracks here. So think of them as tiny little canals, because each one's called a canaliculus, which just means a tiny little canal. And what happens is the osteocyte that is located in the lacuna sends out little arm projections into each of those little canaliculi. And so then they can reach to get the nutrition from the blood over here. And then another little arm will go in this canaliculus, which will meet up with the arm from this osteocyte to send nutrition by diffusion to this cell, which then can do the same thing and send nutrition by diffusion to the next cell, and so on for all the osteocytes going to all the outer concentric lamella. Okay, so let's go back and look at this picture again. The dark areas in this one then are indicating where we have a lacuna that contains an osteocyte. On this power magnification, you cannot tell the difference between the lacuna and the osteocyte within it. So that's why it's just tagged the lacuna containing an osteocyte. But you also can clearly see the little tiny lines, which are the canaliculi. So I have them labeled over here, but if you go to the picture on the left, I think you clearly can see all the lacuna there as, all the canaliculi there as well. And here is a cartoon drawing on the same picture showing the cellular processes of two adjacent osteocytes so that diffusion can happen between each other. So here is the question that you should stop and try to figure out. Since I have told you that nutrients are going to be diffusing from one cell to the next cell, bring back to the forefront of your brain that cells have to have intercellular junctions between each other. So go back and review the 3 types of intercellular junctions and try to figure out which of those 3 types would you expect to have between these 2 cells so that this diffusion of nutrients could occur. It's not as hard as it sounds. So just go back and review those 3 types and what the whole point of them is, and you will get that. If you have any questions, be sure to ask me or email me. All right, so let's continue on. Here is a picture of a model of a bone where this outer part is compact bone. So I think you clearly can see multiple osteons here. I want you to realize in this particular picture on the left, you can see spaces. So this is where the spongy bone is, whereas on the right, this is where the periosteum is. And I know that because I can clearly see the Sharpie's fibers. So on the right is the outer part of the bone, and on the left is the deeper part of the bone. So let's look at this right side of it for a second. And what you will notice is the osteons do not go all the way to the surface. There is an area just below the periosteum where we have lamellae, but they are not part of osteons. These lamella go the entire circumference of the bone. So a huge circle. And so these are called circumferential lamellae. And so we have, maybe a half a dozen of them. And they're going to help resist that long bone twisting I referred to, either because they are going to have their collagen fibers perpendicular to each other. Now, not only do we have circumferential lamellae deep to the periosteum, but if we go to the left where the spongy bone is, you will see that we have circumferential lamellae here, although it's only about maybe 2, 3, or 4 layers of them. So between the compact bone and the spongy bone. So if we look at the photomicrograph down below, you can see that the lower left corner, that's obviously red bone marrow. And just above the red bone marrow, you can see these circumferential lamella. And then as you continue more towards the right side, you can clearly see that we have the osteon multiple, which indicates that is compact bone, because osteons are only in compact bone, not in spongy bone. Okay. So circumferential lamellae are deep to the periosteum for the entire circumference of the diaphysis, and they are also just superficial to the endosteum at the compact bone spongy bone interface. Okay. All right, now one more type of lamella. So if you can envision osteons as being circular structures going the entire length, then I think you can realize, like, okay, so it's like having a bunch of straws. Okay, so if you had a bunch of straws, even if you put a concentric lamellae around them on the outside, you would still have spaces between those straws or those osteons. Well, in compact bone, those spaces are not spaces, they are filled with lamella. And what they are filled with are remnants of previous osteons. So here's how this works, okay? So for instance, let's take this osteon and this osteon, the one at 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock, and you can see that there's part of an osteon up there at 12 o'clock. Well, say the osteon at 3 o'clock sends another layer of lamella, and the one at 9 o'clock does another layer or two as well. And what you can see is there would be less and less of the osteon at 12 o'clock left behind. And so eventually you're just going to be seeing fragments of previous osteons, remnants of them that are left behind as the compact bone remodels. We'll be talking about remodeling later on. Okay. All right, so all that had to do with long bone. But remember, we had 6 different types of bones. So what's happening in the other 5? Well, the exact same thing for all 5. Okay. All the other bone shapes are basically what I like to call a bone sandwich. And for that, I want you to envision peanut butter and jelly on bread. Okay. So the bread, and it's very easy to envision this on a flat bone, but I want you to realize that this is not only a flat bone, but it's all the other bones. Okay. So the bread represents the compact bone, which is on the surface of all bones. Okay, so all bones, the outer portion is going to be compact bone. Okay. Between the 2 layers of compact bone, we are going to have spongy bone, and that's represented by the peanut butter. You know, peanut butter like sticks to stuff. So we've got spongy bone going from this compact bone to that compact bone. But the spongy bone is not hollow. The spaces are filled with red bone marrow, thus the red jam or jelly. Okay, so peanut butter and jelly sandwich is a good visualization for the structure of all the other bone shapes. All right, so this reinforces that we have 2 structural types of bone. We have compact bone on the outside of all of our bones, and that contains the osteons with their concentric lamella. It has the circumferential lamella around the outside of the bone, and it has the interstitial lamella between the osteons. And then in the deeper portions of all bones, in the medullary area of all bones, we are going to have compact bone, we're going to have spongy bone with its bony trabeculae filled with red bone marrow. So let's take a moment to look at the spongy bone. So if you just take the bone and you remove all the other tissue, it has this appearance, which kind of looks very similar to some types of coral. And each one of these structures is called a bony trabeculae if it's big, and bony spicules if it's small. I'm going to use the terms interchangeably, but I just wanted to let you know, sometimes they'll be labeled trabeculae, sometimes be labeled spicule, but essentially they're the same thing, okay? And in these bony trabeculae or spicules, we are going to have all the cells involved with bone formation and remodeling, which we'll be talking about shortly. So we're going to have our osteocytes in lacuna, and we'll also have osteoblasts and osteoclasts, which we haven't talked about yet. And then also these spaces are not hollow, but they're actually going to have red bone marrow in them. In this place, the red bone marrow has been washed out, so you can just see it as a marrow space. All right, so here's a picture showing bone. And if we start with the labeling, this paler pink area, if you look at it closely, you can see little osteons, so that's the compact bone. So what's on the outside of compact bone? That's right, it's periosteum. Okay, so now look deep to the compact bone where you expect to find spongy bone, and can you see any of those bony trabeculae? That's right. That's an example of one. And then all of that dark purple cellular areas among those bony trabeculae, that's the red bone marrow. So we have all those cells, those dark purple cells are all those hematopoietic cells. We've got some little capillaries, and we also have individual adipocytes there as well. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about on this tape is the actual composition of bone. And for that, let's go back and think of bone as a connective tissue, which is composed of cells and extracellular matrix. And if you recall, the extracellular matrix is going to be made up of protein fibers and ground substance. But we're going to look at it slightly differently. So starting first with the cells, this is the simple part. We're going to have those osteochondral progenitor cells, but in this case, because they're going to be making bone, in your textbook, they may, or other places, you may see them referred to as osteoprogenitor cells rather than osteochondral progenitor cells. In addition, we know we're going to have mature osteocytes and lacuna maintaining the bone. We have to have the bone builders, which are the osteoblasts, and then we are going to have cells that are going to break down bone, which are going to be osteoclasts. So we'll talk about their jobs in a subsequent video. Looking at the matrix, 1/3 of it is organic, meaning it contains calcium. That's right. And so the portions that contain calcium are going to be your collagen fibers and all your non-collagenous proteins. So your protein fibers, they're all organic. But also in the ground substance, we have some chemicals which contain carbon. Did I say contains calcium? I meant contains carbon. Okay. Which contain carbons, which are mucopolysaccharides, which I didn't talk about this semester very much. Okay, so if 1/3 is organic, that means 2/3 of it's inorganic. So what do you think that's in bone besides these calcium-based products? Like if I asked you, on the periodic table, what element there would you expect to find in bone? Okay. Well, everybody would say calcium, okay? And so the inorganic 2/3 portion is going to be calcium, and mostly calcium is going to be bound to phosphorus. So there is a term called osteoid, which we will be using in your textbook uses. And anytime you see that word osteoid, what they are doing is talking about the bony matrix. So rather than having, say, the bony matrix or the extracellular matrix of the bone or the ground substance, basically they're just going to use the word osteoid, and then they're going to say, so the osteoid becomes calcified when the calcium gets deposited into the matrix. Okay, and going back, talking about calcium, where I said the vast majority of it's bound to phosphorus, it is bound in a substance known as hydroxyapatite. That's just the name of the compound, where about 85% of the calcium is bound to phosphorus. So I'll be using that term hydroxyapatite again later. And notice this is not appetite like, oh, I'm hungry appetite, where this would be an E. This is apatite, the science term apatite, or the chemistry term, where it's an A form. And with that, I am done with this section. So I will see you again soon, and thank you for all your work in this course.